Hey class, today is a lecture, the first substantive lecture. I'm presenting it as an introduction to kind of big picture issues we're going to be dealing with in this class. And it's a topic that I think is near and dear to many of us that we affected personally by COVID-19. And we're going to trace that to food and agriculture, which is really one of kind of a key sector for thinking about impacts, and something that got a lot of news attention early on in the COVID-19 outbreaks. So I'm now going to share my screen and start going through the PowerPoint slides that I'm also posting to eClass. Okay, so let's just start up here. The first lecture, this is for the week, today is September 3rd, so this first week of September 1st and 3rd. Overview. So this, one or two of you at least participated in a class that I taught as an online certificate course with many others. I coordinated the course this May and June that had really participation from people from around the world. We had about 1,000 people who participated in some element of the class, and about 700 people for each of the sessions that we organized. So this is a little bit of an overview, very consistent with the overview presentation I made as the first lecture in that series. Just start with some headlines. Every day we could find these headlines like this from around the world. India logged the highest single national figure of new COVID cases in a single day anywhere on the planet yesterday or the day before, with 83,883 cases in a single day. The Indian economy during the COVID lockdown contracted by 24%, so a quarter of the GDP lost due to COVID during this quarter in a country which is struggling. From the United States, we have these kind of headlines. Nearly 1 in 8 American households doesn't have enough food to eat today, from the New York Times from today. Also from the United States Department of Agriculture from today, direct government payments could account for almost 40% of net farm income this year. So about the 40% of the income across the agriculture sector for farmers has come from some type of payment or subsidy or handout from the United States government. Also, another headline that was in the India Times in the 1st of September was that the UN Food and Agriculture Organization forecasts that the number of undernourished people in the world would increase by up to 132 million this year, while the number of acutely malnourished children would rise by 6.7 million worldwide due to the pandemic. So a global issue, and you can see how that is manifest in different places. I think that the India versus United States cases are interesting because they are I think the two leading countries in the number of cases with very different contexts. I'm going to I teach another class in the Economics of World Food and Agriculture. I think that some of the perspectives we take in that class are very important. This is going to be a little bit beyond what we can cover in this class, but I think I just want to give you this kind of overview of why thinking about the world perspective on economics of food and agriculture is really poignant and important in the case of COVID-19. A world perspective helps us think about connections, how the fact that there are local parts of our food system, there are national parts of our food system, there are important international dimensions of our food system, and these things are linked especially by trade, movement of food from surplus areas to deficit areas, from places that are specializing in certain types of food to places that don't specialize in that type of food, as well as multilateral agreements and bilateral agreements. So countries have agreements between themselves related to food and agriculture, Groups of countries, like regional trading blocs, like the European Union trading bloc, have agreements as well as their international agreements, such as agreements under the World Trade Organization, but also agreements that relate to food safety. Also, another aspect of a sort of a global perspective is that we see that there's a link between how economies grow and what happens with food practices and preferences of people. There are links between the way that economies grow in agriculture, with agriculture being a contributor to economic growth, especially in kind of early stages of growth. And both of these things are linked to people's health. So we think about this kind of dynamic perspective, and often we think about how variation from one country to another reflects kind of the state of development of its food and agriculture system. Another perspective we get on thinking about this global perspective is the linkages, key linkages between diet and health, key linkages between agriculture and health. And so we think about zoonotic diseases, for example, is a place where the way we do our agriculture affects exposure to zoonotic diseases, and COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease. Also, the way we do agriculture in some places exposes us or doesn't expose us to health risks. So there are places where people living downstream of large intensive livestock facilities are exposed to different health risks. There are also, in developing world, there are places where people are exposed to health risks, for example, malaria risk if they do irrigated agriculture. And the other thing is economics is associated with everything. Economics affects our diets, our food choices, our health, the status of agriculture, and we get a long ways by thinking about how the effect of economics. Food has a life cycle is one more thing that we will study explicitly in this class. It's important to think this through, and how, so as we think about the production conditions and say sustainability of production conditions, the supply chain that links food, that accepts raw food products, perhaps processes it into other products that people want to eat and blends them into recipes. We have food consumption. Our food consumption patterns produce waste, as does the supply chain. And all of those things are affected by supporting services. So we're going to be talking about this life cycle analysis, a particular way of organizing analysis of life cycle in the kind of sustainability part of the class. So we think about COVID-19 effect on world food and agriculture. What do we have to learn from? So in the early days, so thinking about back to March, when we saw that this was going to be something well beyond China and the Wuhan province of China, that this was really going to be a global thing, we started to think, well, what could the effect of COVID-19 be? What do we have to learn from? So we looked at, first, economists and others looked at previous epidemics or pandemics. Pandemic is something which is, a kind of more global phenomena. Epidemic may be more localized. We looked at previous epidemics of AIDS, which is sort of a pandemic, Ebola, SARS, H1N1, which were sort of various combinations of epidemics and pandemics. There have been a number of outbreaks of Ebola, I think 7 in the last 20 years in West Africa. Another very different way is to think about, okay, what was the effect that is really due to the economic contraction that has come about as a result of COVID-19? We could think back to the financial crisis, in the global financial crisis, 2007 to 2009, the Asia financial crisis of 1997, which was very severe. A place like Greece that has really been in protracted financial crisis since about 2010. Another slice is relative to health, is to think about disruptions due to disruptions in international trade. Would that happen? We have experience here in Canada of how an outbreak of a livestock disease affected the receipt of our livestock, our Canadian beef. So the United States put a restriction and didn't allow imports into the United States from Canada because they're worried about importing BSE, or mad cow disease, we called it then. Also, we in Canada here imposed restrictions on imports of beef from the European Union. The BSE epidemic was much more devastating in Britain, for example. So that's one way that early on we try to kind of predict what might happen with COVID-19 using past events. Another week we could think about what's the likely effect of COVID-19 on our food and agriculture is theory, and we have two types of theory just here. From economics about how our food behaviors are affected by income. So we have a couple laws. Engel's law is a general relationship between income or growth of income and overall changes in food consumption. And Bennett's law, which is about highly nutritious foods, and it's linked to income. So we have shocks to income. Bennett's law and Engel's law kind of tell us what might happen to food without us really needing to know much more about the place. And we're going to talk about that next week as key in economic principles. Another way we learned is the fact that different countries in different contexts had the outbreak earlier and controlled it earlier and recovered in different rates. So that's something we can learn. For example, we could try to learn from what happened in China that was really starting to deal with the outbreak in early January, where most of the rest of the world started dealing with it more in March. So China, in a sense, we had two months to learn from China. I don't think we learned enough, for example, about the value of masks from China early on. And then at this point, so we're now, 5 months since March when we started grappling with it here. We have real-time analysis of how things have unfolded. And we also have real-time analysis of the policy responses. And that the evidence base we have really grows every day. Okay. I'm just going to do 2 more slides, then I think I will break this so that you can go back through these slides if you'd like in this lecture before we move into the next module. So 2 more, and then we'll take a break. So there's this, I wanted to talk about, so what was the state of the world early in 2020 that would affect the way that COVID-19 affected our availability of food, things like food prices. What's the story, as well as our ability to respond to the pandemic? So there were a couple things that were really pretty big in terms of good news that have shaped the response to COVID-19. One was that early this year, the world, especially the big production countries, had large supplies and large stocks of basic cereals. So the basic cereals of corn or maize, rice, and wheat, I should have there as well, we had good supplies of and good stockpiles. The world wheat stocks are actually at the highest they've been since in the last 20 years, much, much higher than they were in 2007 to 2009, when there was a financial crisis that caused really a big concern about food supplies. So we had good as nations, we had good supplies kind of on our cupboards, as well as everything we knew at that time was looking pretty positive about future crop forecasts, that so the crops looked like they'd be pretty good. So we probably weren't going to have kind of big runs on our staples that would have kind of contagion effects across countries. Another thing that was different that has evolved over the last 20 years or so, which is sort of good news, is that many countries, many more countries than there was 20 years ago, many countries have some type of programs that provide support for people who are, say, unemployed or destitute or who are handicapped, and they're providing financial support for them primarily, or in some cases in-kind support for them. Many countries who are lower or middle income have had and still have some type of social protection programs that could be expanded to deal with the new situations of COVID-19. The World Labor Organization keeps track of these, and they found that as of 2019, 117 of the 186 countries that they monitor had some type of child or family benefit that was based in national legislation. So that was good news. There was something that if countries decided to, they could reach some of the more destitute people in their societies through these programs and kind of scale up these programs. On the bad news side is far too many people going into 2020 were highly vulnerable. There was a rise in the late 2010s in the number of people displaced. So we had 14 million newly displaced people, according to the UN High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR. 113 million people on the planet were suffering severe acute food insecurity, so really not knowing where your next meal is coming from. 820 million people out of the 7 or 7.5 billion people or so on the planet were undernourished. About a similar number were obese, as well as a variety of micronutrient problems around the world, including iron deficiency and anemia in adolescent girls and women. So real severe nutrition problems and a large group of vulnerable people already going into this pandemic. There also were, in certain places, strong threats to food supplies. For example, East Africa had suffered through two severe droughts in 2018 and 2019, and then we're dealing with desert locust outbreaks, and that I just saw news today about the severity of that now moving to Sudan. African swine fever virus had wreaked a lot of havoc in China, and then spread to other parts of Southeast Asia and now Europe. So these are kind of more localized threats. So in those places, then this COVID-19 was coming in as an extra threat. So we have places where, if you think about the Horn of Africa, large numbers of people who are malnourished, large number of people who are vulnerable, people losing their current crops due to things like desert locusts, and then COVID-19 comes in with its major effects. Okay, so I'm just going to break here and call that number one for this lecture, and then go into the next set of slides after this. So I'm going to stop sharing and then stop recording, and I'll come back in a minute or two.